it's not that easy to run a webinar on such evening. We do try to be cold and professional, and we normally are, but living in an ivory tower is not always an option. We are going to save time and cut with protocol proceedings, if only to allow all our distinguished speakers to deliver around 8 minutes in the first round, and then another 2-3 minutes in the second round, and then 1 minute to wrap up. The Cambridge Center for Palestine Studies is morally pleased and professionally delighted to be holding this exceptional session tonight at a time when events are unfolding in an astonishing manner. And we do have many competitors tonight, especially live news coverage following the strike on the Evangelical Hospital in Gaza, which left, it seems, around 1,000 civilians killed. So we would like to somehow define our structure today. We would like certainly to welcome, first of all, 3 former UN special rapporteurs, Professor Richard Falk, Professor John Dugard, Professor Michael Lynk. So we have this very professional legal side. Then we have got the historical political side, and we are equally pleased and delighted to be having with us Professor Ilan Pappé. And on the other hand, we are having from the States the author, writer, and human rights activist, Suzanne Abulhawa. And we shall be having 2 more speakers, hopefully. One is Crispin Blunt, a member of parliament here in the United Kingdom, who was the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in Parliament. He's from the Conservatives Party, and just this morning, he in fact submitted a notice to the government accusing them of colluding in war crimes, i.e. he is conservatives and they are conservatives, and he's accusing practically his prime minister and government. But we shall be hearing from him. He should be with us, Victoria, if you could kindly follow that. And hopefully, if Hanan Ashrawi is not on one of the channels, she will be certainly joining us. Given this structure and the various angles that we have got with us tonight, I think I'm going to table a suggestion, if I do not mind, Ilan. You are a historian. You are very much related to the region. You are in the UK. You have written so much about the subject. So I hope I am not being too unkind to start with you kindly, please, Professor Ilan Pappé.
Makram, could I just ask a question before we start?
Please.
You said that over 1,000 people had been killed in the hospital. Al Jazeera told me 500, and BBC World still had no news on the subject.
I'm having feed from Gaza. Now, the BBC World, let's leave it aside because I'm not sure they are inside Gaza. I'm having feeds here. It began with 300, then 500, then 874, then now 1,000. This is the feed from Gaza. In any case, it doesn't really, the number here, I am not sure if the number matters, whether it's 500 or 1,000, but we will learn certainly about it. So back to, thank you, John, for the remark. I'm back to Professor Ilan Pappé. So I was saying, I hope I'm not being too kind to start with the historian, Ilan. If I may kindly ask you to open this session, and the screen and mic are yours, please.
Thank you, Makram. It's a great honor to share this webinar with such great experts and moral and political activists. Like everyone else, I find it difficult, as you rightly mentioned, Makram, to stick just to our professional kind of jobs or assignments, and not to let our emotions come into our academic analysis, but we'll definitely are able to do both without betraying our professional obligations. To put in 8 minutes the event in Gaza in context, of course, is very difficult, but I'll do my best.
Ilan, please. I mean, I said 8 minutes. 8 minutes. You can have 10. You can have 12. It's very. The situation is very fluid, and you can fill 20 hours as well, I am sure. Please.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to be brief because I'm really looking forward to hear the others as well. I think it's very important to mention history here, both a more distant history and a more recent history, because one of the major characteristic of the Western media and Western political elites reference so far to what's happening in Gaza is it's totally dehistoricized. It's decontextualized. It doesn't appear within a proper historical analysis. This is nothing new. Most of the coverage in the West, whether by academics or by journalists in the past, it was very careful not to historicize the events in order to be able to start the narrative of the events from a point that served the Israeli propaganda and narrative. And a similar thing is happening today. If you start with the morning of the 7th of October and you don't bring into this an historical context, you don't have either the moral ability to assess what happened, nor to understand fully what is going to happen. And the historical context, which is important, is in two circles, I would say, the more distant past and the more recent past. The more distant past reminds us that we are still, despite everything that happened in the last 10 days, we are still in the face of a historical situation that is ongoing between a settler-colonial movement that was able to create a settler state and an anti-colonialist movement that is struggling against the plans and vision of the settler-colonial state to have as much of Palestine as possible with as few Palestinians as possible. This has not changed. The Palestinians call it the ongoing Nakba or Nakba al-Mustamirra. More academic scholars call it the structural settler-colonial policies of elimination of the native. Elimination can be genocide, can also be ethnic cleansing and apartheid, as we know from the case of Israel. And this has not changed and is not going to change. However, the events are going to unfold on the ground in the Gaza Strip. So I think that's one very important historical context, which you will not hear in the Western media or in the speeches of the politician, but we as academics should insist that no discussion on what happened in Palestine would be devoid, first of all, from this wider historic context. The ongoing ethnic cleansing, the ongoing destruction of the Palestinians that is part of the DNA of the Zionist movement and became part of the DNA of the regime of Israel since 1948. Then there is the more recent events, and this should be taken into context as well. Israel in the last few years has elected governments of right-wing Zionist fanatics who openly talk about destruction of Palestine, of ethnic cleansing, and support actions either by the army or by the settlers in the West Bank against the Palestinians. In fact, an incremental killing of Palestinians that is taking place daily, not to mention also the Israeli policy of criminalization of the Palestinian minority inside Israel, which is also part of this context of recent years to move to a more extreme legal, political, and military actions of destructions against the Palestinian people. Now, the brutality of the Israeli policy in recent years is felt differently in different parts of Palestine. We saw what happens in the cramped refugee camps in the West Bank. They were leading the resistance to that policy with disregard whether they are able or unable to stop the Israeli occupation or criminal policies, but because without resisting, they felt that they don't exist anyhow. And it's felt differently in the Gaza Strip, under siege since 2006, in conditions that the United Nations already warned us in 2020 were not sustainable for people. So this is the kind of explosion that people who were not blinded by Zionist ideology or Orientalist explanation of who the Palestinians are and what they believe in, people who were not blinded by such discourses and analysis knew it was about to happen. Yes, we didn't know when, we didn't know how. I don't think even the Hamas expected to be so successful in the morning of Saturday, the 7th of October. But given all that we know about the recent history and the more distant history, the Palestinian resistance will continue. It will take place in different forms. Palestinian national movement is diverse. It has secular forces, it has left forces in it, and has political Islamic forces in it. All of them are organic part of an anti-colonialist liberation movement that is there from the moment it was clear to Palestinians, leaders and society alike, that the Zionist project is a project of displacement and replacement, not a project of classical colonialism, where the colonialists go back to the mother country at the time of decolonization. So I think that for a moment, you can forget the wider and all more recent historical context when you see the carnage and when you are horrified by human loss. But for that, apart from that moment, it's very, very important to understand that before the events and after the events, we will still be within the same reality that we were in the last 50, if not the last 100 years. An unjust occupation, an unjust colonization, and a decolonization that the West refuses to acknowledge as just, as morally valid, and one that actually should be supported instead of supporting the colonization and the occupation. It's very easy to see how hypocritical and unfair both the West as an elite and as a media, as an academia, is treating the anti-colonialist struggle of Palestine when compared to the way it embraced the struggle in the Ukraine against the Russian invasion, and in the way that we never heard the same kind of rhetoric and discourse from an American president down to members of the British Parliament when Israeli soldiers or settlers massacred Palestinians either on an incremental kind of method or in huge massacres. Let me finish by saying something which is not historical, but I think is very important, and I say it and I derive it from my understanding of the history of Zionism and its policies towards the Palestinians. Contrary to what you hear in some reports, I think, in the media, Israel is not going to go on a massive invasion of Gaza, to my mind. Israel is going to incrementally invade Gaza, slice by slice, they already prepared the Israeli public for that. They told them this is a project of months, maybe years. The idea is actually to minimize the actions, to downsize them to minimal criminal policies in a way that would make the Western media much less interested in it, so that, for example, what happened today to the hospital would not repeat itself. And using the same methods that they're using in the West Bank, by which the only way of understanding that Israel is an apartheid state exercising genocidal policy is only if you look at it accumulatively, only if you understand that this is going on a daily basis of killing 1 person or 5 persons, but you have to have the whole picture to understand the ideology behind these policies, the strategies behind it, and the vision that it is wanting to implement. So I think as an historian, we are in what the late Patrick Wolf called, we are in the middle of a structural event. Namely, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine is going on and will go on. And what happens now in Gaza is much less a retaliation to what happened on the morning of Saturday. It's the same policy that was before Saturday and the same policy that was there in place for so many years. This means that we will still, those of us who are in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, will be again challenged with an Israeli policy which will make it difficult to employ international human rights law, employ public opinion, change positions of governments and parliaments, and the same methods we have used before. We should actually increase our efforts because this will not change after the events of the last week. Again, thank you so much for allowing me to open this webinar. It's a great honor, and I'm looking forward eagerly to hear my colleagues on these important issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilan. It's very kind of you. This is indeed an eye-opener. And I will certainly come back to you, but may I kindly move now from the historical angle to the legal angle. And on this occasion, we have just received a message from MP Crispin Blunt. He will be joining us. He's just voting in Parliament now, but he will be joining us. Straight to Professor Michael Lynk, please. Michael, we have had, I believe, at least 3 webinars in the last 3 years about Gaza, one in 2021, one in 2022, and another one which was a related webinar. And we heard your very magnificent input. Could you kindly try to tell us if tonight or this time is different or not from your point of view, legally or otherwise?
What I'd like to try to do is give a bit of background, perhaps in the few minutes that I have, with respect to the past 16 years, that may lay the foundation for others to be able to build upon. I know 2007 is not the start of Gaza. If I can encapsulate it in a single sentence, somewhere between 75 and 80% of all Gazans, all Palestinians in Gaza are refugees from 1948 or the descendants of refugees. I mean, Gaza and its present situation is very much an Israeli issue of ethnic cleansing and the refusal to recognize the right of refugees to return. Today, we have 2.3 million Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip, roughly about 140 square miles. There is no other place in the modern world where you have such a large population penned in by a medieval blockade that Israel has imposed in full since 2007. It's a comprehensive air, sea, and land blockade. And for those of us who are international lawyers who pay attention to Gaza, we accept, as the United Nations accepts, that Gaza remains occupied territory and therefore subject to the rules of international humanitarian law, even though there are no longer any Israeli military boots on the ground, at least for the moment, with regards to this. I have said, as Special Rapporteur, and I was repeating what both the most recent former Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, and the present Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, have said that that Gaza remains, as I said, remains occupied, and is therefore, this is a classic example of collective punishment. Collective punishment is absolutely prohibited by the Fourth Geneva Convention, Article 33. To move forward, we have seen 6 major conflicts, assaults on Gaza since 2008-2009. In 3 of those, 2008-09, 2014, and on the Great March of Return in 2018, the United Nations Human Rights Council commissioned an independent international study to determine what laws of any of the rules of war and of occupation and of human rights may have been breached either by Hamas or by Israel. And in the first 2 reports, the Goldstone report of 2009 and the Davis report of 2015, it found that both sides, both Hamas and Israel, had likely committed war crimes, and that action should be taken with respect to that. And at the core of what was in the analysis of those first 2 reports was the blurring or the elimination of the absolute distinction made in international law during a time of conflict and hostilities, distinguishing between combatant and civilian. Clearly, Hamas didn't do that, firing rockets into populated areas in Israel, and certainly what happened on October 7th. But just as equally, Israel was found to have likely committed war crimes through its indiscriminate or imprecise targeting of buildings and of people in Gaza City and mostly through the north and center of Gaza. In each of those occasions, the reports wound up saying one of the principal problems with Israel and Palestine is that on the one hand, so much international law and so many UN resolutions wind up applying to this situation, but there is in effect no appetite by the major powers, led by the United States, to impose these UN resolutions from the General Assembly and the Security Council, or impose the strict rules of international law. No matter how many times Joe Biden has said that Israel is entitled to react and to defend itself, albeit within the rules of international law. That has not occurred in the past. That's not occurring right now. So in the conclusions of these reports, I'll just cite one of them, which is the Goldstone report from 2009. It said, justice and respect for the rule of law are the indispensable base for peace. The prolonged situation of impunity has created a justice crisis in the occupied Palestinian territory that warrants action. And each of the following 2 reports also act the same thing as well. International law is not supposed to be an umbrella that folds up at the first sight of rain. It's meant instead to be particularly used in times when people's blood are boiling. And it has been sadly sidelined throughout the 30 years of the Oslo process, and certainly today. We hear Western leaders pointing the finger at Hamas, rightly so, with respect to what was committed on October 7th, and the taking of hostages and the firing of rockets. We hear nothing with respect to the conduct of Israel. Israel is assumed in Europe and North America to be a vibrant democracy that obeys the rule of law, even if it may have sometimes a slightly blinded and regrettable approach towards the question of Palestinian rights. It's far from the truth. Israel stands in defiance of hundreds of UN General Assembly resolutions, over 30 UN Security Council resolutions. It's annexed land in East Jerusalem, which is an act of aggression under the Rome Statute. It has built over 280 Israeli settlements which are a war crime under the Rome Statute and under the domestic legislation of most countries, and has imposed a system of racial discrimination amounting to apartheid, which is again a fundamental prohibition under international law. Israel is not a rules-abiding, international law-abiding nation, and that's missing, as Ilan has so eloquently said. It's missing in the context of the Middle East in general and of what's been going on in the last 10 days in particular. Let me end there and say that the only way to a compassionate peace, where we have the recognition of both the 7 million Israeli Jews living in between the river and the sea, and the 7 million Palestinian Arabs living between the river and the sea, is that none of them are going anywhere, and only on the basis of equality and human rights and the recognition of national rights are we going to reach that kind of peace that land so desperately needs.
Thank you, Michael. Professor Michael Lynk has just kindly and neatly moved us from international law to international relations, which probably should take us also very nicely and neatly to Dr. Hanan Ashrawi before any media or news outlet snatches her from us. Dr. Hanan, can you hear us, please? I hope you can ask to unmute Victoria, or Dr. Hanan Ashrawi is with us, but who knows whether she's talking to a journalist on the other line. In any case, we thought to have her take from Palestine in order to further discuss the issues at hand. But if I can see that she is with us, but it seems that the mic isn't as free as we would have expected it to be. In any case, since we do as well try to strike gender balance here, why don't we just move to the states where author, writer, human rights activist, Suzanne Abulhawa is based, and she's now with us. We are delighted that you managed to make it, and without further ado, it would be great if you could kindly give us a little bit from what you have seen recently in the last 8, 10, 12 days unfolding in the States as a reaction to what has been happening in Palestine, and in particular in the Gaza Strip.
So, as you know, US media has been extremely racist, using adjectives like dastardly and barbaric, etc., to describe what Palestinians do, versus the quote-unquote humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza as if it were as if they were hit with a tornado or an earthquake, rather than intentional genocide. I think Israeli, and we all know this, and we've all heard the rhetoric, Israeli politicians and military commanders have been talking about a second Nakba for as long as I can remember. As far back as 1989, during the Tiananmen Square uprising, Netanyahu famously said that Israel should have taken advantage of that moment when all eyes were on China so they could expel Palestinian masses. They have been obsessed with Palestinian birth rates threatened by Palestinian babies, which they call demographic threats. And I believe that Israel is now implementing a long hatched up plan to effect another mass exodus of Palestinians, as well as another mass land grab. And I think this new land grab is what underpins their call to evacuate 1.1 million Palestinians from the northern Gaza Strip to the southern area. It was reported that Egypt warned Israel that something imminent was about to happen prior to October 7th. And there also have been reports that Hamas had sent WhatsApp messages to residents of surrounding Jewish-only colonies to flee. And I don't know whether those reports are accurate or not, but I don't think we should discount the possibility that Israel knew about this attack and they wanted it to happen. Zionist leaders have historically been willing to sacrifice their own people, including blowing up a ship full of Jewish refugees during World War II, just to make a point to the British. And I'm sure Ilan can speak better to that than I can. But, suddenly the protests that Netanyahu's government hasn't been able to manage, where hundreds of thousands of Israelis have been in the streets over the past couple of months without respite, are suddenly gone. The Israeli people who were at war with each other just a few days ago are suddenly now united behind a fascist right-wing government. All of a sudden, Israel can now push through their so-called judicial reforms. And they are seizing an opportunity to commit genocide and mass expulsion, possibly. And well, they are attacking their neighbors. They have been attacking Syria, trying to draw Syria and Lebanon into a wider war, and maybe even attack Iran. All of these things that they have been longing for a long time are suddenly a possibility. So I don't believe that what's happening now, what Israel is doing, is a reaction. I believe it is premeditated. There is no way one can believe that two U.S. armored carriers, whatever you call those ships, are in the Mediterranean for Hamas. It's and I also, I want to say too that Hamas is literally, and along with other resistance groups, they're literally the only thing that's standing between Palestinians and complete annihilation. Whatever you think of them, whatever people want to say about them, that they're the only ones who are doing anything to defend Palestinians. The media never talks about Palestinians until Israeli lives are threatened. That's a fact. The only time anyone looks in our direction is when something like this happens, when Israel has to taste an iota of what they have inflicted on Palestinians for 75 years. Yeah, I mean, it's the past, none of us are sleeping. We're bewildered. It is incomprehensible to see the level of inhumanity, of death and fear and terror wholesale. And what's worse is to watch how the world is cheering this on, to see Israeli flags projected onto government buildings and sports arenas. The incitement and the hatred is so profound that it just leaves you breathless. And it's hard to, it becomes hard not to support Hamas, frankly. And, I need to be honest about that. Nobody, honestly, I think regardless of what you think of what they did, it is no different than what the the slave revolt led by Nat Turner in 1831. It's no different than indigenous Americans attacking European settlements and killing everybody in there. We had a simple literature festival 3 weeks ago. It was an incredible moment of indigenous agency, of togetherness that Palestinians have not had in my whole life. We had Palestinian writers and intellectuals and thinkers and scholars from every part of Palestine and every part of our diaspora gathered in one space to celebrate our heritage, to honor our ancestors and uplift our young people. And we were attacked mercilessly. There are still calls in the media for, and they're calls, I mean, you can see it in the media and in university statements that are drawing a straight line between our festival and Hamas. They brought the full weight of a massive, well-funded Zionist network, complete with political connections to Governor Shapiro here in Pennsylvania, donors for the University of Pennsylvania. They brought the full weight of all of that money, all of those political connections, all of that power down to bear on our little all-volunteer, cash-strapped group for having a literature festival. You know, on the one hand, it's exhausting and it's terrifying, but on the other hand, I mean, this is a microcosm of just indescribable ghastliness of what they're doing in Gaza. But I think, you know, when you wade through the rubble and the fire and the terror, what you see is an utterly bankrupt, morally bankrupt settler-colonial state that has nothing except a brutal military, period. And that there was somebody at the festival during it was an audience member. His name is Mahmoud Munna. He said when we were talking about Shireen Abu Akleh's murder, he said, you know, when Shireen was killed over a matter of 3 days, first when they killed her and, you know, in 2 days when they attacked her funeral. And he said it was one of the saddest days of my life and one of the happiest, and obviously sad for obvious reasons, but he said it was one of the happiest because he realized that a state that would first assassinate a journalist and then attack her loved ones, trying to bury her with some dignity, is a state that is a morally destitute state that is running out of time. And I think, you know, what Israel is doing and what their supporters around the world are doing does feel desperate, and it does feel like they are on their colonial deathbed. I think that Israel is probably Europe's final settler colonial hurrah in the world. And I think we have to find a way to ensure that it does not succeed. And this is not a call to push anybody into the sea or any of the ways that such words are taken. This is a call to eliminate the settler colonial apartheid Zionist entity and the horror it has wrought, not just on Palestinians, but on the whole region and indeed the world. And if I may, if you could please just indulge me 1 second. One of our dear friends who is stuck in Gaza now, his name is Ahmed Isa. he asked if I could please just read this small note from him. He said, "I am Ahmed. I feel that I am a target. Everyone is a target. What I'm experiencing now is genocide. Today, my close friend Muhammad, his wife, his little baby, his girl." Sorry, it's hard not to. They were murdered while they were sleeping. I am not afraid to die, but I am afraid to be a number along with my wife and 2 children. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne, for your first intervention. You have mentioned a few terms which also take us neatly to Professor John Dugard, namely apartheid, ethnic cleansing. Professor Dugard, in addition for being a leading professor in international law as well as a lawyer, he in fact experienced firsthand in South Africa apartheid. And John, we on numerous occasions in the past we discussed these 2 issues and the intersectionality between them. Before we went live, I was rereading the paragraphs and the definitions and the difference between apartheid and genocide convention. And I wonder if you could kindly shed light, because I have a feeling that people talking about historical Palestine with these 2 political actors competing and fighting not only over land as well as the narrative, some people ought to somehow disentangle the 2 definitions between apartheid and genocide. So it would be great if you could kindly, Professor John Dugard, shed light on this, clearly in addition to whatever material comments you wish to. So we are delighted also to be having you. You are one of us, so it would be great to learn from your observations, please.
Thank you very much, Makram, and good evening to all. I'm going to speak frankly tonight, and in the light of this, I think I should at the outset make it very clear, lest I be accused of being unsympathetic to Israelis or anti-Semitic, that I strongly disapprove of the atrocities committed by Hamas in southern Israel. They were war crimes and crimes against humanity. But now let me proceed to tonight. I think it's important to realize that tonight a red line was crossed. The killing of 500 or more persons, or perhaps 1,000 persons, in the strike on a hospital, which by all accounts was deliberate bombing of a hospital where people had taken refuge or where people were, because of their injuries, gives rise to a completely new situation. For the last 20 years that I've been involved in the Palestinian issue, I've carefully refrained from using the G word, genocide. I led a fact-finding mission into Gaza after Operation Cast Lead. There were a group of 6 lawyers on that commission. At the end of the 10-day investigation, I was chair. I said to my team, what crime has been committed, and without hesitation, they all said genocide. And I was shocked because I knew that politically it was totally unacceptable to use the word genocide in respect of Israel. So we managed to change it to collective punishment. Richard will recall that when the Russell Tribunal met after Protective Edge, that there was a move to describe Protective Edge as genocide. And I think Richard was more or less in favor of it. I was opposed to it. And so we compromised and we spoke about incitement to genocide. But I think that the line has now been crossed, that one can safely use the word genocide. One doesn't have to debate the question of the similarities between apartheid and genocide. I think it is clear one doesn't need a court of law to pronounce upon Israel's actions. I think that we can now safely use the word genocide to describe Israel's actions. It has now demonstrated the necessary special intent to destroy in whole or in part a people, namely the Palestinian people. And so I think we now can use the term apartheid as well, but one may also proceed to use the term genocide. I think tonight we have to consider a number of questions. I suppose the first immediate question is whether President Biden will have the temerity to actually visit Israel tomorrow, whether he will cancel his journey as we speak. And then there are other questions, such as whether there will be a third intifada. Already there have been demonstrations, protests in the wing, but I think that tonight's action may well push the Palestinians, the West Bank, over the brink and into a third intifada. And then there's also the question about whether there will be worldwide protests in Arab states and the rest of the world, and possibly even Western Europe. I think we should pause at this stage to ask what about international institutions. And let's be quite frank, they have failed us dismally. The United Nations, Secretary General has failed us. Security Council has failed us. The General Assembly has failed us. I think it's important to realize that the General Assembly has been very wishy-washy in its resolutions on the subject of Palestine, if you compare them with the resolutions that it adopted in respect of apartheid in South Africa. Where is the resolution calling for an arms embargo of Israel? General Assembly has not attempted this. Then, of course, there is the European Union and its leadership, which has sided wholeheartedly with Israel, as have Western governments. I'm delighted that the ICJP has indicated that it will serve notice on the prosecuting authorities, or charge before the British prosecuting authorities, Prime Minister Sunak and the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, for aiding and abetting crimes. And I think they might add the crime of genocide here as well. Of course, the first prize must go to the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court has had the question of Palestine referred to it for many years, and the court has found that it does have jurisdiction to investigate the matter, but the present and new prosecutor, Khoury-MaChool, has deliberately and carefully, I repeat these words, deliberately and carefully refused to bring a prosecution against Israel when the evidence was abundantly clear, particularly in respect of the construction of settlements, but also in respect of the events in Gaza. Under pressure from Western states, the prosecutor of the ICC has deliberately and calculatedly refused to participate in prosecution or to bring a prosecution against Israel. And he has even refused to pronounce upon the subject. His predecessor, Pappé ILAN, on many occasions condemned Israel for its actions. He has remained absolutely silent, a total disgrace. So he must get first prize for the poor record of an international institution. But let me just say in conclusion that civil society hasn't done much better either. If one looks at the protests against apartheid in South Africa, in the Western world, they were vigorous, extensive. Protests of this kind have not been heard in the Western world or in the rest of the world for many years in respect of Palestine. And so I speak with a sense of despair. No doubt what I've said tonight will be hailed as anti-Semitic, but I think this is something that we have to face, that while politicians may be excused, forgiven for doing nothing because they are afraid of being accused of anti-Semitism and then losing their positions of power, I think we as ordinary civilians must have the courage to speak out and to call a spade a spade. And that is what I've tried to do tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor John Dugard, for this contribution. Please stay with us. If I may kindly ask Professor Ilan Pappé to get back to the screen, please, in order to discuss one very pressing point, Ilan, if you can hear us, in case we would like to discuss this. Ilan, a few days ago, and just because I remembered what I'd heard at SOAS 20 years ago or more, I had dug a little bit and published an article in Arabic. It focused on Bernard Lewis's and Henry Kissinger's vision towards the Arab world. And in fact, I found out that there was a plan, or at least part of a plan, to transfer all Palestinians from the Gaza Strip to one of 3 states that may be established in Egypt, and get rid of that part of the Palestinians. When I published that three days ago, I received a call from an academic who asked me, did you find any other Israeli source talking about Palestinians being transferred, or a plan to transfer them from the Gaza Strip to Egypt? And in a second, I searched, and there you go. I found no less than in the Jerusalem Post on the 24th of July, 2014, i.e., we're talking about 9 years and 2-3 months, where someone called Martin Sherman, Dr. Martin Sherman, who it seems is a defense advisor at the Israeli Ministry of Defense, wrote an article published in the Jerusalem Post, and the title of the article, and this is why we chose, by the way, the title of this session. The title of this session is Why Gaza Must Go, Will It? So his actually article was titled Why Gaza Must Go, without a question mark. And there he wrote, the only durable solution requires dismantling Gaza, humanitarian relocation of the non-belligerent Arab population, and extension of Israeli sovereignty over the region. And he goes on and on where he says we have before us an ordeal and we must fight and we must win, something similar to what we heard from Netanyahu and Gallant. Could you kindly shed light on this approach, Israeli approach, obviously?
Yes, I think it's important to remember, first of all, how the Gaza Strip was created. Israel created the Gaza Strip in 1948 as a rectangle that was supposed to be a huge refugee camp that would receive the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians Israel expelled during the 1948. That's why Israel did not occupy the Gaza Strip. There was no opposition. Israel could have taken the Gaza Strip in 1948, but it decided to create it as a huge refugee camp because it was clear to them that the Egyptians would not allow them to push hundreds of thousands of Palestinians into the Sinai Peninsula. Then came 1967, when the Israeli territorial appetite clashed with the Israeli demographic dream of having a state without Palestinians in it. So they incorporated both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It's in June 1967, the Israeli government was trying again to find a different solution for Gaza, this time either to expel the people to the West Bank or to the Sinai. And again, because of circumstances, I don't have time to go into it, this plan did not materialize, but the intention was there. So in many ways, if you think about the Israeli policies after 2005, after the so-called disengagement from Gaza, the Israeli policymaker, and there's a consensus in Israel about is that the West Bank will always be part of Israel. How exactly to rule the Palestinians in the West Bank may be a tactical discussion the Israelis would have, but they do believe that they can have the West Bank either directly or indirectly. What they seem to be lacking is a clear strategy about Gaza, and it's not surprising that in such a situation, the ideas that you have just mentioned are part of the alternative that they are discussing. As you know, they opted for a different option until recently. The option was, since we cannot do what we do in the West Bank, namely take the Gaza Strip, incorporate it physically into Israel, we siege it, we ghettoize it. We build a ghetto called Gaza, and we somehow hope that this can be sustained for a very long time. And even the Israeli military did not object to the fact that it had a place where it can exercise its forces, and the Israeli military industry could show Gaza as a laboratory for its new weapons of destruction to anybody who was interested in using these weapons against their own people or someone else's people. This has collapsed on the 7th of October, 2023. The strategy of ghettoizing Gaza has collapsed. We understand, I think, you and I and many of those who are listening to us today and looking at viewing this webinar, understand that any alternative that does not include the decolonization of the whole territory and the creation of a democratic state is bound to fail. Now, failure, unfortunately, means, first of all, a lot of innocent people dying, especially a Palestinian and suffering. So, yes, I think Israel would now explore more seriously the idea of mass expulsion. In fact, it started the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. Ironically, it is the Rafah crossing that stops this ethnic cleansing from becoming massive. But we have to be very worried and to be very alert and to see whether this is not another massive ethnic cleansing that the world may very weakly, very softly, and not very convincingly condemn, and would create yet another Palestinian refugee problem. So, as far as Israel is concerned, morally, strategically, or politically, what Mr. Sherman wrote in 2014 is a sound alternative in their eyes. But so many of the so-called sound Israeli policies can take place only if the international community and the region is silent about these policies and does not object to them strongly and condemns it, and even uses methods such as sanctions in order to stop them. Otherwise, I'm afraid the Israelis have no moral scruples or inhibitions in implementing such a policy, either under the pretext of war or under any other pretext that they would find if they would deem this is the best solution as far as they are concerned.
So am I right in thinking that what you mean is that if now, for example, a broader, wider war erupts, it may well be it'll provide.
Makram, sorry, can you repeat the question? Because I just had I'm being collected to a meeting, but I can still answer the question. Do you mind just repeating the question?
Sure. What I'm saying is that just judging from what you said in your last couple of sentences, am I right in thinking that if now a broader war will erupt, do you think that it's a possibility, or what's the likelihood of Israeli government implementing such transfer from the Gaza Strip to the Sinai?
Well, first of all, the transfer to the Sinai needs an Egyptian collaboration on this. And as all we hear from Cairo is that Egypt doesn't want a massive number of Palestinian refugees in the Sinai. So I'm not sure how easy it would be for them. In fact, that's what worries me so much, because if the Egyptians do not collaborate with it, massive ethnic cleansing is turning into genocide, and that's what we are seeing. But because I think, and I might be wrong, I think the Israelis are going now for an incremental occupation of Palestine, as I explained in my introduction, which will include incremental ethnic cleansing. It won't be the 48 transfer as we know it, but the similar incremental ethnic cleansing we have been seeing in Jerusalem, in Masafi Riyata, the south of Hebron, and in other parts of Palestine. And we'll need again the international community to galvanize an international community against not just massive Israelis violations of human rights, but continue the struggle against the daily violations, because after this war, this kind of Israeli policies would continue.
Thank you, Ilan. Now we also as well can neatly move to Professor Richard Falk. Richard, we have got here an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary discussion where media, narrative, discourse, international law, politics, history are all intertwined. But Ilan has just mentioned the international community. So far, from what we can gather, most of the official Western world, namely NATO and the EU, are publicly and strongly supporting Israel's policies. How do you explain that, not only politically, but as well as from a legal point of view? This clearly leaves them exposed to the ICJ, possibly.
Well, Makram, you raise a haunting question that has, I think, been part of the presentation, the very moving presentations that we've heard. The international community, led by the United States in this context, has culturally embodied what Edward Said wrote about in terms of Orientalism. It has treated Palestinians as not deserving of the kind of protection that human beings are entitled to under international law. And it's important to appreciate that this dehumanization of Palestinians, as Ilan Pappé has been reminding us, is something that has existed for decades and has been brought to the surface long before the October 7th Hamas attack by the way in which Netanyahu described the relationship to the Palestinians and the turning a blind eye to settler violence, the burning of villages on the West Bank, and a prelude to what we can't really in good conscience not call genocide. The evidence is overwhelming, it seems to me, and has been substantiated by the blood-curdling language that the Minister of Defense used when he established the decree, the siege of food, electricity, and fuel, as well as water. This is explicitly genocide. It's not a humanitarian crisis. I mean, it would be like calling the worst kind of period of Nazi government a humanitarian crisis. Of course, it's horrible for the victims of these policies, but the essence of what is happening is a deliberate elimination of the human qualities of that underpin international law, human rights law, the obligations of an occupying power. There is no ambiguity here, and this brings one to the failure of the international community to what John Dugard in his closing remarks said, calling a spade. There's this unwillingness to address the factual reality and to accept the obligation that's in the Genocide Convention. People concentrate on whether these acts are sufficient to qualify as genocide, which is Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. But they forget Article 1 and the title of the convention, which is the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide. The international community has a clear legal obligation to do all in its power to prevent an ongoing genocide. And it is failing, as has been pointed out, at the highest levels of integration, the UN. It is embodying the premise of a world in which geopolitics has primacy. In other words, the moral hypocrisy and the legal double standards of the way in which the Ukraine attack was addressed and the way this Gaza catastrophe is being dealt with exposes the whole structure of injustice and exploitation that is embodied in the way in which the world is organized at this point. And my own country, I'm ashamed to say, has been the architect of this kind of domination of people, a kind of recreation of colonial geopolitics that asserts Western hegemony as even to the far corners of the world, whether it's the Pacific or Latin America, Africa. It's a Monroe Doctrine for the whole world that was established after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that's never existed in modern times. That one has such a concentration of geopolitical power.
Richard, there is something wrong with the connection.
Yes, I can't check. I have a very stubborn phone.
Until you fix it, let's just move to Michael, please, if I may, Professor Michael Lynk. Usually what we have seen in the past is a sort of silent approval of some members of the international community to Israel's war crimes or policies or atrocities. But this time, the support for Israel's action has been forthcoming, clear, loud, and nearly like a Western orchestra. And it has got, it seems, from what we heard, quite a few implications. Could you kindly let us know, from your point of view, what sort of legal implications it sheds or projects on these international powers who actually clearly, publicly, on record, said that they agree and support Israel's genocidal policies and practices?
Tomorrow will be an interesting day to see if we start to hear some words of shame by Western leaders with respect to the unbridled support they have given to Israel to date. It was clear when Israel decided to launch its latest assault on Gaza after the horrific events of the 7th of October that this is going to create suffering and death on a massive scale. Only those who, as Ilan Pappé had said, have a decontextualized understanding of Israel and Palestine, they're the ones who may be surprised by what we're seeing now. It was inevitable with a large-scale military assault on crowded, heavily populated city of Gaza, Gaza City, with the refugee camps in the north, and also we're seeing strikes through the center and south, that there was going to be overwhelming civilian casualties with respect to this. Israel, on the one hand, says that they act with precision, and certainly the United Nations has conveyed to Israel on many occasions the exact coordinates of every UN school, every UN facility, and every hospital in Gaza. So for a hospital to be hit and to sustain such large casualties, either was deliberate, and we have no evidence of that yet, but certainly at the very least was highly negligent by Israel, and that would probably account for what the Geneva Conventions forbid as indiscriminate attacks on a populated area. I want to say as well, with respect to international law, what was proclaimed by the defense minister on the 7th or 8th of October, that there's going to be this complete siege of Gaza. No water, no food, no fodder for animals, no power and electricity, and no fuel for generators and for the desalination plant and for the electricity plant. Is absolutely forbidden by international law. International humanitarian law forbids starvation as a use by an occupying power or a military force in a war zone against the civilian population. It also absolutely forbids the denial of the necessities of life, including electricity, water, and so on. And we haven't seen these restored in the 8 days since they've been cut off. And we've seen, obviously, this huge lineup of humanitarian aid at the Egyptian side of Rafah, not being allowed to enter into Gaza to provide these billions. Certainly when you read the stories today with respect to those who did heed Israeli calls for the evacuation of the north and head to the middle and the south of Gaza. They are now they've been without water for days. They're drinking either dirty water or trying to dig holes near the ocean to be able to reach the aquifer. And as I said before, the central aquifer underneath Gaza is 97% unfit for human consumption. It's been contaminated with sewage and seawater over the years. And really the only water is either water that is pumped in from Israel, which is now cut off, or water from the desalination plant, which is now run out of fuel and no longer operates as well. So all of these humanitarian conditions are on top of the humanitarian crisis that was there since 2006 and before, now is a humanitarian catastrophe, and none of it is lawful under international law. You know, as I made my point in my previous statement, this is always seems to go down the memory hole for Western political leaders, that they have a very clear political and even legal definition with respect to Hamas, but they tend to forget or ignore or brush aside the repeated designations of Israel as a serial defier of UN Security Council resolutions, and has been found to be likely the commission of war crimes in all the previous UN Human Rights Council reports as well.
Thank you, Michael. By the way, I have just received possibly a clarification I have no from a priest saying that this hospital, which was hit and has got a strike which led to the killing of hundreds of civilians, this hospital belongs to the evangelical church, which is headed by a Palestinian Christian Anglican bishop, who in fact carried the sacred Palestinian olive oil from Jerusalem to be handed over for the coronation of King Charles here in the UK, which means that this sort of free or protected zones, not only as hospitals, but as well as zones which belong in a sense to international or local Christian churches, has been hit, and a very serious line has been crossed indeed. So this just comes to show that there is a double action here against the hospital and against a church. Could I kindly go back to Susan Abulhawa? You are in the States, you are deeply connected to Palestine. What can you tell us about the differentiation, if it's possible to make it, between the official American administration and public opinion? Do you see any difference between both of them?
So the United States, as you know, is a very big place, and I don't think these sort of broad generalities can be made about the whole country. But what we do see is there are massive protests in the streets for Palestine, in support of Palestine. We're not seeing street protests in support of Israel, and where they do exist, they are not well attended. So there's definitely a disconnect between the official, American stand and what people are expressing in the streets. But the United States is also marred by kind of apathy and disinterest in global affairs unless it affects them directly. They're also not given accurate news. I mean, mainstream media is heavily influenced by Zionist narratives. So they're not getting, I mean, I believe that if the American people really knew what was happening in Palestine, things would be very different. And which is one of the reasons why Israel concentrates so heavily on pressuring the media and putting out narratives and whatnot. But I also want to say something about international law, and with complete respect to my esteemed co-panelists, international law has been it is a Western construct whose application has historically been at the whim of Western nations. For the global South, international law has been used to wage genocidal wars against us. I mean, Iraq being a case in point, or to prosecute African leaders or other leaders who don't serve Western interests, while turning a complete blind eye to Western war criminals and their client regimes around the world. So I think it's important to speak honestly about the reach and the application of international law, not just its theories and semantics and definitions. We have a massive stack of UN resolutions, lots of thoughts and prayers, both sidism statements, broken agreements, lies, and tricks that have done nothing to stop Israel from continuing their settler-colonial campaign of erasure and genocide against us. International law has not saved us. Boycott has not. Peaceful demonstrations have not. We've been killed and maimed and dispossessed and erased and robbed and terrorized for nearly 80 years now without anyone looking in our direction, except when we fight back in such ways that make Israelis feel insecure or threatened, period. Whether whether or not people want to hear this, those are the only real moments when the world has ever looked our way. We went from one country to another, one court to another for years. But it was only when Palestinian guerrilla groups started hijacking planes in the 60s and 70s that our existence, our mere existence, was even acknowledged. We languished under systematic terror for decades. And it was only when Palestinians launched the first Intifada, a popular uprising with rocks. But the important thing is that it made Israelis feel insecure. And so the world finally took note of us. And one tires, honestly, of sort of, and I know we're all impotent, we're all doing the best we can, but one does tire of hearing empty words. When, even condemnation of Hamas, we don't want to hear it, frankly. We're not interested.
Thank you, Suzanne. Please stay with us. John, please, Professor John Dugard, please.
Yes, Makram, I would simply like to say in defense of international law that it is largely a Western construct, as Susan has rightly pointed out. And in the early post-World War II years, European states took the lead in promoting human rights and using international law as an idealistic system to promote human rights and to decolonize and to promote self-determination. But in recent years, the Western powers have found it very difficult to apply international law because of their commitment to Israel. And we see this particularly in respect of the United States. I've not heard President Biden use the term international law. He prefers to use the term rules-based international order, which is something else. And the reason he does this is because he knows that he has one set of rules for the international community and another set of rules for Israel. And Israel is a special case to which very special rules of law apply. And that's why we see President Biden and indeed other Western leaders using the word self-defense to protect Israel or to justify Israel's actions, when in fact, self-defense does not permit action of this kind. And so I think that one should realize that international law has in fact been hijacked by the Western world in order to defend Israel.
Right. Sorry, Richard, I think and I hope that the line is better now where you are. But you were actually talking about the role, so to speak, the role of the international community and the duality between the lack of international political will and the existence of international law.
Yes, I mean, I agree with what John has just said. I think that what has occurred in this period is the political hijacking of the more idealistic aspirations of international law, and that has been most evident at the expense of the Palestinian struggle and the Palestinian people. But it is a geopolitical hijacking, and in some degree that was written into the UN Charter, giving the most powerful and dangerous state the right of veto, which in effect is saying to them, international law and the UN Charter doesn't apply to 5 states if it clashes with their strategic interests. And we see that in its grossest form now in this justification of what is the most explicit genocide that has occurred since World War II, and for the most self-promoting political democracies to associate themselves with that is not only a matter of legal bankruptcy, it's a matter of moral and spiritual bankruptcy as well. And that's very important to absorb. But it's built into this architecture of international order that has emerged after the Cold War. And again, it applies in many different contexts, but most grotesquely, it has been enacted at the expense of the Palestinian people and Palestinian struggle. Let me just say one thing about the distinction between apartheid and genocide, which you raised earlier. Apartheid, as was practiced in South Africa and by and large in Israel, except for these ethnic cleansing and military periods, is a system of inhuman control, inhuman and exploitative control. Genocide is a matter of either killing or eliminating a particular ethnic group that stands in the way of a dominant or a group that is seeking their replacement. And settler colonialism has a genocidal agenda embodied in it, because unless it eliminates the native population, it tends to lose control, and what Susan referred to as the desperate element of the present phase of struggle is a certain deep insecurity in Israel that unless it completes the Zionist project by replacing the native Palestinian population, if it is doomed the way South Africa was doomed and the way Algeria was finally defeated, no set colonial project has succeeded unless it has either totally marginalized or eliminated the native population.
Right. Okay. In fact, I've got here at least the main critical articles from the Genocide Convention, which clearly states what you've said, including killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm or to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And then Article 3, it says that those articles which are punishable: genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide, and then direct and public incitement to commit genocide, and attempt to commit genocide, and complicity in genocide. And I believe that this complicity was exactly what MP Crispin Blunt, who is now texting me saying that he has just finished in Parliament, and he will try now to join us. But Richard, if we are at it, this complicity article or issue, how easy or not easy can it really be implemented at a court of law when a British member of Parliament from the Conservative Party, from the ruling party, says to his Prime Minister, you and others have been complicit in this or in these war crimes, and that he's going to take them to British court and then possibly the ICJ. How easy or uneasy is it to do so?
Well, it's never been done, and so it's an unprecedented initiative, and one has to assume that it runs against a great deal of political resistance. And law and legal institutions are not immune from political considerations. So it's a domain of uncertainty. But what it all opens up is the possibility of civil society taking initiatives. It seems to me there's a very strong case for constituting some kind of people's tribunal that is capable of reaching clear and relatively quick results, and has moral authority, if not legal enforcement powers. but it can appeal to civil society through other kinds of informal sanctions. And I would trust people-oriented initiatives, including BDS, to much more than I would have confidence in intergovernmental or governmental institutions at this point.
Thank you, Richard. Michael, just before you go, please, I know that you've got another appointment. Could I kindly ask you to just a little bit explain to us about the issue of trying to ban pro-Palestinian demonstrations or to ban raising the Palestinian flag in Western countries? How does it work and fit the so-called Western democratic constitutions?
Constitutions in my country and in the United States and in the European Union, not in Britain, have constitutional protections for free expression. Most courts, on most occasions in recent years, have given a broad right to freedom of expression, and laws that attempt to regulate waving of Palestinian flags or chants in support of Palestine would be, I think, per se, probably unconstitutional. Having said that, I'm certainly aware of constitutional precedents in the United States that Richard may know and Susan may know more about this than I do, which have actually upheld laws that target BDS, which seems to be contrary to everything that American constitutional principles on free expression would have stood for. But I guess now I must say I've seen these reference to these laws both in France and in Germany in the last couple of days with respect to attempts to legally curb expression in support of Palestine. I can only imagine that it will take years, but those kinds of curbs would be unlawful and unconstitutional under the European Convention on Human Rights. And with that, I'm afraid I have to go. I have another interview to do in a few minutes, but thank you so much, Makram, for inviting me to be part of this, and particularly with such a stellar number of panelists, all of whom I've learned a great deal from today. All best.
It's been a great pleasure having you here with us as usual. Your input is quite unique and has got a different North American angle as well. Thank you for that. Now, could I kindly, until Crispin Blunt actually joins us, could I kindly ask my colleague, Dr. Victoria, to make a few comments that she has gathered about what we have heard? Please, Victoria.
Thank you, Makram, and thank you for this platform. And first of all, apologies for my voice. I've been protesting. I would like to give my condolences to all of those who have suffered in this terrible massacre, this absolute crime against humanity in the Episcopal Church Hospital in Gaza. And my thoughts and my heart are with the victims of this absolutely horrific atrocity, on which is the darkest day of Palestinian history in my lifetime. I think what we can sort of gather from this emergency onto emergency, onto further emergency, is the need and the stark need to do something. And with this brilliant panel that I thank you for putting together, Makram, I really, really wonder if there is something concrete that can come out of tonight, especially after what has happened in this tragedy, in this Israeli-made tragedy, in this deliberate crime of genocide. And I don't know whether, for example, after this, we could potentially gather a letter to the British policymakers. I think that the Anglican Church as well needs to be held to account. We've not done enough so far, and it's their church who have been bombed. So they need to put pressure too on the British establishment to halt this absolute atrocity, this genocide that I cannot believe is unfolding between in our eyes. But I don't know what the panelists think. Possibly a letter to the Times. Myself as a member of the Palestinian community, and we have seen an attack on something that is a very close, a hospital that is very close to the heart of the British Palestinian community. So I do believe that we need to act in a way, in a concrete way, and maybe with the support of Crispin, who has now arrived. So I wonder if people would put their names to a petition, or if there is a way that we can at least threaten. I understand that there is no precedent and that it is difficult to take any of these criminals, war criminals they are, Rishi Sunak, for his complicity in this crime. And I understand this, but we've had citizens' assemblies. I mean, we had the Russell, we've had the Russell Tribunal. I mean, and I think that we really need to at least up the ante, and maybe Crispin can tell us how we can do that and support him and his efforts in Parliament.
Thank you, Victoria. Actually, you have literally neatly bridged our discussion with MP Crispin Blunt. Crispin, if you could kindly unmute yourself. Crispin has been a member of Parliament for several decades. And he was the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, which is possibly one of the most serious, if not the most serious parliamentary committee. And he has literally in the last few days launched this remarkable move, and he has just actually left Parliament trying to lobby some of his friends. But without further ado, I will not talk anything. Crispin will take us through and how things unfolded, and what is your take, Crispin, and what are your plans, please?
No, and a small exam question there, Makram, right at the end of the meeting for your poor listeners to have to endure. But briefly, I am the co-director of a law centre called the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians. I set it up with a human rights lawyer called Taib Ali, who is now the managing partner at Bindman's, as well as director of ICJP. And it was our intention to have a justice vehicle which Palestinians could access in order to try and find a way to find restitution. And we have over 100 years, for examples of dispossession of Palestinians in one form or another, whether individual or collective. It's not as though there is a shortage of material for cases that might be taken on behalf of Palestinians. We're absolutely determined the centre should not be part of any faction within within Palestine representation that we should be absolutely independent. And our objective was then to then identify what cases we would be able to take as we gradually grew our resources and our reputation. We've only been going 2 years, and we are representing Abulhawa, the American Palestinian journalist assassination league. We're representing the International Federation of Journalists around the media center that was dropped in Gaza in 2019, and a number of other particular cases. Until, of course, we were then presented with this emergency over the course of the last 10 days. And equipped with access to some very fine human rights lawyers who have been associated with the development of international law in the space, particularly around the Rome Statute, which underpins the operation of the International Criminal Court. We've then seen that there is now capacity to hold foreign governments to account if they give unequivocal support to a state that is engaged in war crimes or about to be engaged in war crimes. And that is, of course, the tragic position following the appalling atrocity by Hamas on the 7th of October, that the Israeli response followed a pattern that was entirely predictable and familiar, but of a scale that reflected the scale of the atrocity suffered by Israel. And we have had to wake our leaders up to the fact that they are liable under the law if they give unqualified encouragement to the state of Israel in these circumstances, that they will be complicit in the war crimes that are now taking place. And those crimes are defined in international law, principally the Fourth Geneva Convention, also the laws of war that are developed out of that, and the case law out of that. And so last Friday evening, I and Tayyip Ali wrote formally to the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, and the Attorney General to say that we were putting them and all, potentially all the officials in the government on notice that we would indict them for war crimes if the language around the actions of the State of Israel continued to be as it was. And that language has at least started to change. And it can only be our hope that with the arrival of President Biden in Israel, that the probable pause in or the fact that there won't be a land invasion, I anticipate, whilst he is there, combined with this awful event this evening, with I'm not quite sure exactly how many hundred people have been killed in this hospital in Gaza. If anything is going to wake the world up and our leaders up to do their legal duty and act to restrain Israel from committing a crime that is not going to help Israel, let alone anyone else, is only going to make matters infinitely worse. It's why the laws of war are written in the way that they are. It's why that they forbid the mass transfer of people. It's why they forbid collective punishment. It's why they require principles of proportion, precaution, and distinction in the targeting that states undertake, all of which Israel has already been massively in breach of. And I'm hoping from the, I think there's a change in atmosphere. I hope that our work has also communicated itself to other jurisdictions, and other jurists will copy us in holding their governments to account. And that will help Israel receive a much firmer message from her mostly democratic allies about the accountability that is expected. And that then has, I believe, then a chance, particularly with President Biden visiting there now, to enable a a wholesale change of direction and a ceasefire now, which, following this awful hospital outrage, is surely the case that is unanswerable. We need to get the ceasefire in. We need to start getting aid in reversing the collective punishment of no water, no food, no power, which is bound to start having an absolutely dreadful effect on 2.2 million people crammed into the area they are, with some of them crowding around the Rafah crossing, trying desperately to get across because they holders of foreign passports as well as a Palestinian one. The situation is quite desperate, and I hope that the international community now realise its duty, and its duty in law is very clear.
Crispin, you have been, I think, a member of parliament for nearly 3 decades, and you are a member of the Conservative Party, the ruling party. Many people are asking, how come that now Israel has managed to gain this public support, even maybe an illegal one, and how come it shifted, the support of Israel shifted from silent support or go and do your stuff and we will not cause any troubles, to public support, borderline supporting war crimes, as we heard from your Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, and as we heard from Braverman with regards to the Palestinian flag, and as we heard even from Keir Starmer. How did this happen? How can you analyze this shift from silent support to public support of nearly war crimes?
Well, I think that that is now changing, I believe. And obviously, that question has obviously lots of complicated factors kicking around in the history of my party and the time I've been in Parliament, and the influence of the very active pro-Israeli lobby that has been well funded and extremely well run, and has been highly effective in inducting my colleagues as candidates and as young members of Parliament into the Israeli point of view. As an element, it's what I grew up with my mother's milk, and so I came of age in 1978. By which stage, as a teenager, I'd seen the Yom Kippur War, which looked to me like from that perspective, as a surprise attack on Israel from two neighbors. Brave little Israel had won the 6-day war against all the odds. That was then accompanied by, in the public mind, by a Palestinian response, which was hijacking aircraft and the attack at the Munich Olympics, all of which served in the sort of general mind of a young boy growing up to paint the Palestinians in a pretty bleak corner. If at the same time you're reading the history of the Holocaust and seeing what's happened to the Jews, it is not entirely surprising your default outlook at that point is sympathy for these people who have had an appalling time in Europe over hundreds of years, and appear to be a democracy fighting for its life in a very hostile environment indeed. And there are all these other problems then being visited out on the rest of the world as a consequence. Of course, I now know that was not the whole picture, and I have learned, I hope, much more about the whole picture. But members of Parliament like me are relatively few and far between who can put all of this into a historic context, who understand that the Balfour Declaration was two-sided and one side has been honoured and the other not. And just how entwined in the history of Israel and Palestine the history of the United Kingdom is. And I believe that does confer a special responsibility on us. If it has to be our courts that are holding our leaders to account, simply to obey the law, and there is no more important law than the laws of international armed conflict, or more serious considerations about what is now being faced by 2.2 million people in Gaza. The only thing there that appears to be protecting them is if the law can be brought to operate and people understand their accountability before the law. Let's use it. Let's make sure we can exercise as much influence as we can. And if it has to be at the end of a threatening letter from a Conservative member of Parliament to his Prime Minister, who he adores and respects hugely and thinks is in every other respect, has the capacity to be a very great leader of the United Kingdom if he gets another term of office, who I might add is being opposed by a human rights lawyer with a shadow Attorney General who is also a human rights lawyer, who have said, who have made absolutely no challenge whatsoever to the Prime Minister's position. Absolutely none. It's shaming. And both parties are in this place where the proper influence over them appears to be missing, and that's what we're trying to do. I'm so sorry, I've gone on far too long, and I'm now going to say good night to you all. Thank you all very much for dropping in. But Makram, it's all your fault for inviting me at this very late stage. So I'm going to give you the responsibility for extending all of this. But I will pay off with what I hope is the payoff line, which is I want ICJP to have the capacity and the resources to bring the world's best lawyers to bear on behalf of the Palestinians, on behalf of the legal and moral authority that the Palestinian case commands. And it is through the issue of writs, backed up by lawyers, filing cases to whatever jurisdiction we can find that may host them, that we can begin to roll back 100 years of the history of the dispossession of the people of Palestine, and get to a place where we can finally arrive at negotiations which have a prospect of achieving a permanent settlement between these two peoples, whether it's one state or two states. As far as I'm concerned, it doesn't really matter. I think one state solution is rather attractive if you can protect the people's rights within the constitution of that state, that it's not just sufficient waiting out when there will be a majority of one person over the other, but fundamental rights protected, and to make Israel-Palestine a story of 21st century reconciliation that can make people as proud as the establishment of Israel was in the terms of providing a safe place for the Jewish people after centuries of pogroms and the rest that they suffered. Let's try and make that the story of the 21st century.
Thank you very much, Crispin. It's very kind of you to have joined us. I know you had a very difficult and stormy day, but still it was great to have you, and we shall continue as we have agreed offline and see what can be done. Thank you so much.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Anyway, you can release his hostage now. Right, okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.
At least
right.
I released.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Susan, I can see have just reading your if I may say so, your body language, that you have something to say about what you heard from Crispin Blunt.
Really, am I that obvious? Never been good at a poker face. I don't know. I want to reiterate that international law no longer interests me, because it's clear it does not actually serve those who are truly weak, except in words and theories. You said at the beginning of this call that the murder rate was up to 1,000. In the span of this conversation, it has now risen to 1,300 from a single strike on the Baptist hospital, where whole families had gathered in the courtyard, sleeping on concrete, believing that they would be safe in a hospital run by Christian charities. If Israel thought that bombing civilians would lessen support for Hamas, they are sorely mistaken. Even Hamas critics have now become supporters, because what is crystal clear to us at this hour is that no one is coming to our aid. No one. There is no one willing to defend us. Not the international community, not the self-righteous, irredeemably corrupt, supremacist Western powers, not the craven Arab rulers, and not the treacherous Palestinian Authority. You will be hard-pressed at this hour to find a single Palestinian who does not now support armed resistance, including and especially those in Gaza who are suffering the most. Whatever faith or hope we had in law or UN resolutions or any of these lofty ideals that the West dangles before us is gone. We have ourselves and the goodwill of free people and people of conscience of the world. And we have our brave sons and daughters taking up flimsy light arms against a nuclear power. Israel has miscalculated our attachment to our homes and our history. Like all supremacist colonial powers, they underestimate and have always underestimated the resolve of indigenous peoples for freedom in their own homelands. They underestimate our love for each other, for our ancestors, for our heritage, our history, and our children. They will lose, like all cruel and soulless colonizers who live by the criminality of their military might, they will fall. One can see now, I believe, through the fog of these horrors that are inflicted on the bodies and on the lives and the dreams and the futures and the psyches and the souls of families in Gaza. Right now, it is clear to me that this genocidal state will fall in my lifetime. And I look forward to that.
Thank you, Susan. John, Susan has just mentioned that it seems that the number of casualties reached, or it's now more than 1,300. And in the beginning, when I said it's nearly 800 or 1,000, you sort of wanted to have precise numbers. But in terms of numbers, does it really, and I'm asking here perhaps legally, does it really matter whether we're talking about 500 or 1,500 in terms of international law and the definition of genocide?
No, it doesn't count at all. I was simply confused because there was a difference between Al Jazeera and BBC World. And I'm still confused because I've been outside for the last few minutes and Al Jazeera is still saying 100. So obviously there's a dispute about the number of people killed, but whatever it is, it's a substantial number. And I think a substantial number gives rise to a substantial concern. And I think Susan has expressed that concern wonderfully. And I must say, I share her despondency, whatever the numbers.
Thank you, John. Richard, as always, as usual, we would like to hear a wrap up, please, from your point of view, from your huge experience in politics, UN, academia, in this moral involvement. You have been a pilgrim all over the world and a public intellectual deeply involved in what is happening and deeply opinionated. What is actually waiting for us all?
Makram, can I say that Richard should have the last word?
Yes, it's Richard.
Yes, let Richard have the last word. I'm not going to say anything more.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is exactly what I meant. Thank you. Richard, can you hear us?
I think this has been a extraordinarily responsive panel to an impossible task of addressing something that exceeds the moral and legal imagination. So I think the panel has done heroically in and movingly in trying to bring some kind of focus to these terrible events. I think Victoria posed a question: is there anything we could do as a panel to make this something more than the session we've had? And it occurs to me that a statement may be signed by the 6 of us that calls on governments and people of conscience to denounce genocide in Gaza is something that's worth doing. Because it not only calls attention to the existence of the genocide, but also to their complicity by their failure to do what is possible to bring about a ceasefire and some kind of restoration of not normalcy, but post-catastrophe adjustment. I'm at a loss for the right words. I think one could perhaps challenge this endorsement, this silence and implicit endorsement of genocide by an effective campaign to denounce genocide, an anti-genocide consensus, that if we can agree on nothing else, we should be able to agree on the unacceptability of genocide as a tactic of political behavior. And I would favor trying to draft some kind of statement that is builds on what you said, Makram, pointing out not only Article 2, but Article 3 and Article 1 of the Genocide Convention. And to ground this in the language of law without succumbing to the mystification that law is on the side of justice generally. It is strategically relevant in this situation we confront. How we get such a statement drafted and effectively distributed is a question maybe for your center. I think it could be an important document. Let me stop there.
Can I just make a comment? I've just seen a news flash in which Israel claims that it did not fire the rocket, that it was a rocket from Hamas which went astray. So I'll leave you with that thought.
Okay. This clearly can be validated, but in any case, this is something very interesting. And judging from what we have been hearing and from the unfolding events, it seems that our next session will be sooner rather than later, it seems. Ladies and gentlemen, I must admit that despite my experience, and some of you know that I was shot in Gaza in December 1987, and at that time, when I was a journalist, I practically broke the first Palestinian intifada to the world, at least in terms of communication. And I must admit that despite my cold-headed and professionalism, I have to admit that it hasn't been that easy to run this panel, let alone the hours in the run-up to the panel and the preparations. But in any case, I am truly delighted that all speakers have been absolutely magnificent. Each one of you has extended whatever feelings and professional approach they could, and you have kindly furnished us with a magnificent and varied accounts, and you literally did not spare anything you wanted to say. And we always say that living in an ivory tower or a detached ivory tower is somehow is neither moral nor right. And I'm delighted to say that it's always good that we combine theory and practice, where practice questions theory and theory informs practice. And this is what we have done. So, Susan, you have presented a magnificent couple of pieces tonight, and we truly thank you for that. Ilan, who has left us, was truly forthright and was even courageous with his assumptions and scenarios. John Dugard, as usual, your comparative analysis is always something to cherish. And we as well very much thank Crispin Blunt, who made it, and also Professor Michael Lynk, who had this interplay between politics and international law. All of these clearly cannot but stand next to the magnificent, legendary Richard Falk, who has been supporting us in the last few years and continue courageously to not only to propose ideas and initiatives, but also, and I'm delighted to say, to even support Victoria's suggestion tonight for this interesting statement, which actually reminds me that exactly 20 years ago, when I first started teaching at the so-called University of Cambridge, you remember that the war on Iraq was launched at that time. And I remember how many academics actually started and initiated petitions and letters to the British government opposing the war. Who knows what will happen? Strictly speaking, this is not the position nor the duty of the Cambridge Center for Palestine Studies to do it, but I think that when there is a truly shocking event or unfolding events taking place, I think that morality should supersede cold ivory tower, no matter in which weather and atmosphere we live. Ladies and gentlemen, I would truly like to thank all those who attended this webinar. I am told that we cannot even have proper stats. I can tell you that at least from one room that I am seeing, we reached 1,000 viewers or participants, guests. I don't know what happened on other platforms and YouTube, etc. But it has been a great session about a very tragic situation. But I'm sure that we will try and keep trying to ring the bell as usual and ask every professional and moral person to contribute whatever they can. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for having attended, spoken, helped, and hopefully a better night for everybody.